Welcome to Sartor TV, an idea-sharing platform founded by Russell Sartor, who's an author, investor, and the CEO of Netcom Learning and AI Certs. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Vanessa Druskat today. She's an expert on emotional intelligence and team effectiveness, and her new book, The Emotionally Intelligent Team, explores how teams can build trust and perform at their best. Vanessa, thank you so much for being with us today. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Vishal. It's really my pleasure to be here with you.
So just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and your career journey and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I first learned about the importance of emotion in teams when I was taking a team facilitation course when I was in graduate school. And what I learned in that course was that if you watch the emotion in the room, you could pretty well tell what was going on in the team dynamics, because emotion is contagious. And so people, if they feel one way or another, they pass that on to folks. So I always remembered that, and I incorporated that in a lot of what I did. So eventually, I was invited by some colleagues to write a book chapter on what an emotionally intelligent team would look like. And I brought in a good friend of mine, Steve Wolff. We built a model of what an emotionally intelligent culture would look like. And Harvard Business Review ended up getting a hold of the chapter. In fact, I think it was Daniel Goleman who gave him a copy of it. He liked it so much. And it just hit the big time. And a lot of people loved it. They loved the idea of, scaling emotional intelligence, that you didn't have to develop one person at a time. And they love the idea of a culture, that sort of an emotional culture. So since then, that article has been republished 6 times in various, volumes that they sell, best-selling articles, et cetera, et cetera. So they were after me for several decades, 2 decades really, to write this book. But I wanted to take the model out and test it in organizations, as any good as you can relate to, Vishali, any good change agent would do is take these ideas really out. I'd done some of it, but I did a lot more of it in another 15 years. And then I wanted to write the book. People kept telling me, this is an actionable model. It's really useful and helpful. It teaches people how to build teams, and you need to write the book. So that's what I did. I had to actually sit down for a long time, and that's not an easy thing to do for somebody like me, but that's what I did, and the book is done, and I'm really pleased with everybody who helped me write that book, who helped me get it out.
Yeah, that's amazing. So if we dig a little bit into your book and some of the things that you've written about, what would you say is the biggest myth about emotional intelligence in teams?
Sure. So the biggest myth is that you just need to hire emotionally intelligent people and put them in a team, and the team will be emotionally intelligent. But what happens is, first of all, it's hard to find a lot of emotionally intelligent people. And second of all, put anyone in a team, and if the environment isn't conducive to emotional intelligence, it's teamwork stirs up our emotions. We lose our ability to manage ourselves well. There's never a time we're more emotional than when we're in teams. I mean, researchers like myself have been calling teams emotional incubators for decades. You get people in teams and the dynamics spin around and people behave in weird ways. So it's hard to be emotionally intelligent in a team unless you have help. And so that's what team emotional intelligence is. It's not about hiring for emotionally intelligent people. In fact, I usually tell people that they should hire for skills and then build an environment that brings out people's best sides and willingness to be generous.
So actually, let's step back. Define what emotional intelligence is.
Good. Okay, good. Thanks. So emotional intelligence is using emotion as data. We human beings are emotional. We've now had 2 Nobel Prize in economics recipients tell us that we we're not rational thinkers, we're actually emotional thinkers. So Daniel Kahneman was the latest, Herb Simon was before him, and both of them basically showed people that our individual brains are so affected by emotion, and we don't realize it. We think we're rational. So if we recognize that we're emotional beings and we get in touch with the emotion that's affecting our behavior, that's driving us, then we can manage that emotion. And more importantly, often, especially in teams or in organizations, every interaction we have is an exchange of emotion. And so emotional intelligence is awareness of the emotion I'm sending to you, and awareness of the emotion you're sending to me, and then sort of management of the interaction, so that we both, so the outcome is effective for both of us. And so again, emotional intelligence is about, we think about the individual competencies that make it up, but it's really about awareness of our own emotion as data, awareness of the other person's emotion as data, and then managing that as best possible, so that we can have a good interaction that produces, develops relationships and produces what's best for us.
Yeah. And so how does a person develop emotional intelligence then?
Sure.
Is it something you're born with? Is it something we can develop as a skill?
Yeah. Well, it's something that we do develop, but and we develop it over time, really. So the more emotional experiences you have, the more you've had to be confronted with tough emotions, the more emotionally intelligent you can potentially become. These days, they build emotional intelligence in kids in a lot of school systems. If you're lucky enough to live in Illinois, it's required in the public school system. And what they do is they help kids label their emotions. So it turns out you recognize your emotions more easily. You recognize it in yourself and others. And you can understand that emotion a little more if you can actually label it. So for example, you know the difference between sadness, anger, nervousness. And so school systems help kids label that stuff. It's the same thing actually that we do with autistic kids. When autistic kids in school systems, what we do is we show them pictures of faces and we help them interpret the emotion, because autism, and there's not just one form of autism, but it tends to be on a spectrum, and it often means that you don't see emotions in faces very, very, very easily. And so you can help people learn how to read those emotions. I remember reading to my kids when they were little, and since I know something about this, I used to say, so what do you think that person's feeling right now? Why do you think they're behaving that way? Well, that emotion spurs that kind of behavior. If you're sad, you're more likely to do this. If you're anxious, you're more likely to do this.
So then, Vanessa, how do emotionally intelligent teams differ from simply having emotional intelligent individuals?
Okay. Turns out that when we enter teams, a couple of emotional and social needs are activated. And some of these will sound familiar to you. We have a need for trust. We have a need for control. But the biggest need of all is our need to belong. And so let me define belonging for you. It's the need to feel accepted and known, understood, valued, and supported, mutually supported. And that's the one, researchers feel like belongingness is the most important social need we have. And we're wired, it's an involuntary need. And so in teams, you have to have interactions that support those needs. Otherwise, bad behavior emerges. And so emotionally intelligent teams build norms and routines that convey belongingness to one another. And what it does is it manages the emotion. It basically builds more positive, more constructive emotions. And it even allows for more openness in the way we talk. And I can tell you more about that. if you're interested. We're more honest in the way we speak because we're not trying to belong. If we know we belong, we're in. And so emotionally intelligent teams meet the social and emotional needs of their teams. And so they become aware of that and they manage that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does.
Good.
So you mentioned these teams have routines, right?
Yes.
So
Good.
can you provide an example?
Yes, absolutely. Be happy to do that. So let me give you an example of what happens in many team meetings that I observe. So as I mentioned to you, I study team cultures. I go from team to team to team, and I watch what goes on in these cultures. The teams will be doing the same task, but the way they interact is very different. In some teams, people will be talking, and folks will be picking up their cell phones. I'm looking for my cell phone because I wanted to demonstrate what that feels like for you, but you probably know. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Or they'll be looking away, or they'll be typing on their computers. Now, here's the catch. They never do that when the boss is talking or when people with high status are talking, because belonging is automatically afforded to those folks. You get a pass on the need to belong. Status gives you that, but they do it when others are talking, and that affects people's behavior. I mean, you automatically realize that you're relatively invisible. Your views don't matter so much, so you stop contributing so much, or in some cases you start behaving badly. You start repeating yourself. You're starting to get belligerent. And the research on this is quite interesting. Nobody can understand why people get belligerent when they're not listened to. But here's the catch. You can't force yourself into belonging. You can't make people listen to you or care about you or know you or value what you say. And you have to be invited in. And so this is where the norms come in, by the way. But what happens is at first, people will ingratiate themselves. So they'll try to get in and it doesn't work. So then they start to behave badly. And so meta-analyses of research shows that, people they'll lose their ability to control their emotions, and they'll start, many of the bad behaviors, dominating, repeating the same things over and over again, interrupting people, or even just, folding their arms and not paying attention. All this kind of behavior. I can give you another example if you'd like to hear an example of how we turn that around with someone by changing the norms in a team. So I get brought in a lot to work with teams because of bad team members. Everyone thinks all eyes are on the individuals. Everybody wants to fix this person. When in fact, the idea is that the norms aren't giving that person a reason to trust, to feel any sense of control, or letting them know that they belong, right? So in this one team we worked with, there was this guy who my team members and I named the knee scratcher, because that was the tell when we knew he was about to blow, right? So in the middle of the meeting, he'd start scratching his knee, and then all of a sudden something would go wrong, right? And you just knew that was going to be. Well, we work with that team, and we said, okay, what we did, and this is how we help teams change their norms, is that we measured their norms, and we measured things like, does everybody get listened to? What are the habits that you have? And I can tell you more about that in a minute. The book, by the way, includes a short assessment for that. But so we measured it. We showed them the results. It showed that the people don't feel like, not everyone feels like they have a sense of control, or not everyone trusts, not everyone feels heard. So then they talked about it. They decided they were going to change their norms. And I'm telling you, this guy got right on board. He was all of a sudden, a really good team member. And so the message from that is that, sometimes this bad behavior is an indicator that there's something up with the norms, that they're not meeting these core needs of people.
Interesting. So as you're working with these teams, it's about just surfacing these sort of bad behaviors, and just kind of talking about it as a team, making sure people recognize them.
Sure. Well, it's about teaching them that building a good team isn't about fixing people. Building a good team is about taking a look at the ways you interact, the norms, what's normal behavior in this team, and then saying, hey, do you like this? Do you want to change it? Here's some ideas from our research that you can use, that you can apply to improve your norms. So let me just step aside for a second and say something about the research, because this is really critical to everything we're talking about here. So for my research, I went into organizations and studied the norms of the very best teams I could find. So, for example, my very first study was in an organization with 300 teams in a manufacturing organization. They were all pretty much doing the same thing. It was a great team to start off with because you could measure performance so easily. You know, how many widgets are they making? You know, how much waste product, et cetera. So anyway, my mentors pulled out for me a sample of the top 10% and a group of average teams. And I studied to see what the great teams did that the average teams didn't do. And so my first study, I built this model of what those behaviors were. And then I replicated that, did that study over and over again in a bunch of other organizations. And so we ended up looking at these patterns of interactions that were similar across industries. Another big one, we spent over 3 years at Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals looking at their drug development teams, because as you may or may not know, getting drugs to market fast is a huge advantage for pharmaceutical companies. And the company wanted to know, what Johnson & Johnson wanted to know, what is it that they're doing in these great teams. So again, we did the same study. And so what you find are that the differences are, well, first of all, is you have to have clear goals, clear roles, and some of those basics. But those don't lift you up to that top high-performing level. Other norms do, including treating people like they belong.
Yeah.
Okay, so this what happens is when you're paid attention to, when you look people in the eye, nod your head, which we've helped teams, we've started teams doing sometimes, they choose to do it, then people share more information. They build more trust. When you're listening to me, when you ask me follow-up questions, it helps me feel more authentic, and it helps me trust you more. It helps me contribute more. And that's only one. That's one category of norms that we build. There's 3 categories altogether that I discuss in the book. But anyway, there's 3 categories of norms that we see over and over again in these tippity-top great elite teams. And we've been able to build these norms in teams around the world, including teams that work remotely.
How does that translate? What you talked about these norms and behaviors that show up in these high-performing teams. What does high-performing mean? Give us some examples.
Yeah.
What that looks like.
Sure. So, obviously, in that first study with the manufacturing job, it was easy to decide what the high performing was. So, and by the way, let me just tell you, in that study, we found that the top 10%, each of those teams was making $9.8 million per year more for the organization than the average teams. And which in a manufacturing organization makes a difference, especially this was in the 1990s. So these little things, the ways they interact and support one another have, a financial impact. And we know that culture has a financial impact. All right. It gets more complicated when you get into more complicated kind of work. At Johnson & Johnson, we looked at percentage of goals met. So each of these teams had, a set of goals that they had to meet. And so we looked over a period of time and we looked at the percentage of their goals met. We also got nominations from people at high levels of the organization. Which teams stood out for you? And we got nominations from people who'd worked on teams or interacted with other teams. Which teams that you know of or that you've worked with, which of these seem to really be the best of the best? And so we used all those nominations to pick out the sort of top 10% that we came up with, and then we studied them like crazy to find out what they did differently. So that's what we did at Johnson & Johnson. That's what we did at I'm not allowed to tell you all the names of the companies, but in the banking industry, in the insurance industry, we did this, in many different engineering teams in different industries. Mostly it was are you meeting your goals? Are you surpassing your goals? Things like that.
Mm-hmm. And so what are some things that an organization can do to sort of foster this in their organizations and build that ecosystem, emotionally intelligent ecosystems to help
Yes. Thanks.
thrive?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, that's exactly what it is, an ecosystem. Well, the biggest thing they can do is they can teach their leaders how to build teams. We don't teach them. We have an individual bias. I mean, I have made it my business to go around and find out what's being taught in MBA programs and executive ed programs all over the country and at organizations. I've sat in on many of these. And we don't teach people how to build teams. Nobody's done that research. I mean, that's another reason why I wrote the book. It's a holistic model, and I talk about how you can go from step to step to step and use it as a roadmap. So we teach people at best, we go to these exec programs, we teach them about self-awareness, and we teach them about, emotional intelligence or how to manage conflict. We don't talk about how to build a great team. We do teach them about personalities in teams. Everybody loves to talk about, I just ran a workshop recently where someone stood up and raved about this great personality test that they used in their teams. And everybody now knew everybody's personality, which is critical. Let me just say that that's powerful, but it's one thing. It's one way of getting to know someone. It's usually a one and done and not something that happens as a routine. So back to your question. I think that we need to start taking team building and team leadership seriously. But one more thing, I don't want to blame it on people who run these programs. The industry of researchers tends not to answer the question. Academics like to focus on personality because it makes for a quicker, faster publication. It's simple. We measure it. Everybody agrees what personality is. It's not messy. And a fascinating review article came out, review of 25 years of leadership research. And what the review said was, hey, we know that the behaviors that leaders engage in matter. And it's linked to higher team performance. We just don't know how those behaviors play out. We don't know what they're doing with those behaviors that create that high performance. Someone's got to figure that out. And so that's what I'm trying to answer in this book. And that's what I think organizations should focus on more often, is help these poor leaders to teach them how to do it, because there's so many bad teams out there.
So can you take us through an example of a team that transformed through this emotional intelligence?
Sure. I can take you through a couple of examples, but I'll take you through my favorite example because this was a pretty stark change. This was a sample of it was a remote team, and it was a team of engineers, and they started losing market share, basically. Like what they were doing in their organization was not all of a sudden. They'd been doing well, but what's happening these days is competition is just swooping in. You don't even realize it's there, and all of a sudden it's taking over. And so they got angry. Their boss, the team leader, got fired, and they were super angry with one another. They blamed one another, every little thing, and this is common in teams. People start competing at moments like this. They fear for their own jobs. We see this all the time in teams, especially if something big change is going on. People fear, and so they get more competitive rather than more cooperative. When cooperation and collaboration is the key. I mean, that is the source of the competitive advantage in so many organizations. So what happened was they came to us. Well, actually, they didn't come to us. We came to them. And the new team leader called us in and said, you got to help me because this is an angry group, and I need to kick it off well. So I'll never forget the first meeting where they started screaming at my colleague and I. They were like, you don't know how to help us. We just got to get it together. And they thought, many of them had PhDs in engineering. So it was, they were the kings of the hill. They really felt like they were kings of the hill. Everyone thought they were the smartest guy in the room. So anyway, we peeled it away and we evaluated their norms and we showed them the data that said that some of them were more respected than others, that they weren't evaluating their performance. They weren't working together to look proactively and strategically at where they were going, which, by the way, is another one of these norms that we see in the high performing teams. And some were participating more than others, et cetera. They looked at that, and of course the competitive side of them made them say, oh my gosh, blah, 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 blah. And so we built relationships, and we had them come up with new ways of behaving. And this was this fabulous team that decided they were going to do a lot of small acts. They decided, I think maybe I mentioned this earlier to you because it's one of my favorite examples. They decided they were going to nod their head and look one another in the eye while they were talking. And it was hilarious because, these were sort of very masculine engineers who didn't put a lot of stock in soft skills. And so it started out as a joke, and it ended up having a huge consequence. They started sharing more information. They started sharing challenges that they were having. And then people started saying, hey, I got that challenge too. They started working together more. And so that, amongst other things that we had them do, laying out, once we got them interacting in a more equitable, palatable, cooperative way, the solving problems became less about blaming and more about thinking about what other small changes can we make that can make us soar. And so in the end, they ended up doing really well. They ended up, within 6 months, basically, they were so smart and capable. There's so much talent wasted in these smart, capable teams. We do a great job of hiring, but then we don't do a great job of getting people to share their knowledge. The number one fear of leaders is that people are holding back and not helping one another. That's about team norms. That's about team culture.
So what do you recommend teams or leaders to do to sort of reflect or assess their current state?
Yeah. What I recommend is that they acknowledge this is going to be difficult for them. And this is why what I find is that leaders who are a little more emotionally intelligent have a much easier job at this, because every leader fears losing control with a team. Let's face it. People are aware, they fear conflict. They fear so much. Wild dynamics are fearful unless you're used to them. I always feel like one of my biggest roles when I go into work with teams is sitting there calmly during their conflicts and let me tell you, sometimes I have to fake it. But I know that calmness is contagious, and I do trust that they're going to be fine in the end. I really do. But anyway, leaders have to get into that mindset that they've got to go to the team, give some control over the environmental norms and the way they work to the team. So that's the first. And then they got to ask the team, what's working well, what's not working well. Let's look at our patterns of behavior, and they need to start making changes. Team members have so much information they don't share with their leaders. When I talk to team members about what they do and don't share, it just blows me away. Leaders don't, they don't know, but you can get that information if you're open for it. And then you got to hear from everyone, and not just the high status people. You got to hear from everyone. So let me stop there and then ask if you have follow-up questions, because there's more I can share.
Yeah, well, curious if you've seen different generations on a team affect the way sort of emotional intelligence shows up, or the way it's
Sure, absolutely. Honestly, I haven't, since I've been writing for the last three or more years, I haven't seen this latest generation, post-COVID generation in the workplace all that much, but I find generational differences to be a lot like cultural differences. So much of it is about getting to know one another's preferences. So back to this norm in our model, which we call understand team members. It's the most important norm in the model. It links to performance in all teams, and I can tell you a little bit more about it in a moment, how I discovered it. But basically, it requires that you peel the onion of the people, and people want to be known. And so what I see is that we have stereotypes of people, and people have different needs, and generations affect that. But if we peel the onion of who these people are, we build more respect and we let go of those stereotypes. So for example, I remember a leader I worked with once, he basically said, these folks just need to work hard. Nobody gave me any of this when I was coming up. This is a very high level leader in a top organization. And if they would just work hard, well, you know, he what he really needed to do and what he ended up doing was listening more to these people. He had such a talented group of folks. And the more he learned about them, the more he saw those talents. He was jumping to conclusions. But we had to sort of force him to build this norm. I basically go in and try to build this norm right away with teams, which is learning something about one another. It's the same thing with culture. I work with a lot of international teams with different cultures, and you know, people behave differently. I'll never forget working with a team that had half Japanese and half, you know, people from the US, and the people from the US were saying, you just need to tell us the truth, and the Japanese were saying, yes, we're going to tell you the truth. Whereas they, you know, that was not how they operated. You know, they were more, their Japanese norms were about saving face for other people and you know, having these conversations behind closed doors. And so one of the things I do is I talk a lot about cultural differences, and I peel that layer with teams. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I can keep going or I can stop. Let me stop and let me ask another question. Sorry. You can see I'm enthusiastic about this.
Yes. So it really is really interesting, all of this, right, when it comes down to human behavior. Are there any red flags that leaders should watch out for that could indicate emotional intelligence is maybe breaking down in their teams?
Sure, absolutely. And there's also a way to deal with it. So I look at the emotion on people's faces. You know, emotion is contagious, and people will, you know, if they are disinterested, if they're disengaged, if they, you know, they're not participating, they're being quiet, what you need to do is ask questions. What's going on? What do you need from me? You know, what do we need from one another right now? You know, a lot of, I would say, since the pandemic, a lot of teams have needed to build more resilience. And, you know, the teams that were emotionally intelligent were poised for this, because resilience is not an individual attribute, it's a process. When we're in with a group of people who we feel support us and care about us, you know, who are willing to listen and provide ideas that can help us move through challenges, we are more resilient. So anyway, red flags are always about the emotion, and it's not. It basically means you got to ask questions, and you got to say what's working well, what do we need more of, and that's what the great leaders did during the pandemic.
So then, how do you, just talking about AI a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
As AI sort of, you know, continues to reshape the workplace, how do you see it influencing emotional intelligence and team dynamics, especially as we're seeing human interaction being partially replaced or mediated by, you know, these AI systems? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, so let me preface this by saying I'm not an expert on this topic, but I do have some feelings about it. You know, I would say for the last 15 years, I keep hearing about technology that's going to make teamwork easier and easier to control. And so, I mean, that's come out in surveys of leaders. You know, when leaders are asked, you know, what are you counting on you know, for the future? What do you need? Well, I need technology that's going to help me manage my team better. And certainly technology has helped communication. So we definitely have seen a lot of great applications and things that have helped us improve communication. But nothing can compete with the motivational boost we get when people around us are treating us like we add value, you know, or asking us questions, and or listening to us, or are working together, integrating their ideas, debating their ideas, and coming up with new ideas, new innovations. You can't replace that with technology. what I see, what I think is going to happen with AI, and I hope it's going to happen, is that every team is going to have some kind of AI assistant that helps it work on its task, that provides, reviews of information and things like that. But it's still going to require people to get to know one another and bring out the best in one another to deal with that information, to solve those complex problems. I mean, take something really difficult like climate change, right? I mean, obviously AI can help us come up with ideas and things, but many of those ideas compete with one another. And they need to be grappled with. And we need people who think big enough, and we need experts, and we need to have relationships with people who we can bring in and treat well, that can add to what we're piecing together for some of our solutions. So anyway, that's my take. I think technology is fabulous. I'm excited about AI. I just don't think it's going to replace human interaction. Again, human interaction has been the source of every innovation ever, including AI. It needs to be the source of how we use AI to solve problems.
Yeah. And finally, if you could leave future leaders with a piece of advice about building thriving teams,
yes,
what would it be?
Okay, great question. I would point to these 3 clusters of norms that we've found in the great teams. I feel like starting with the model that we've got is a great place to start. I mean, it's a great beginning for assessing your team and starting the conversation of what kinds of norms and habits and routines and rituals you need that are going to improve your performance. So the first cluster is about the individuals, supporting the individuals, getting to know them and their proclivities. I mean, think of it this way. Could you imagine a sports team where people didn't know one another well enough to know how to pass the ball or who was going to be where when? I mean, you need to know one another to do well, and you need to give one another feedback and help one another meet your individual challenges. Again, think about a team of musicians or athletes. That's what they do. That's what we need to do more often in the workplace. So that's the first bucket. I would focus on that first to build a foundation of trust. That's how you build trust. That's how you build psychological safety. The second bucket is about thinking strategically and involving everyone in assessing what's going well and what we need to keep our eyes open for in the future. And so, I just call it a plus delta. Put it on the wall. Plus what's going well. Delta, what kind of changes do we make? What kind of adaptations are coming down the pike? That conversation that allows everyone a sense of control of what the team's going to do is invaluable for building a sense of belonging and a sense of ownership within the team. There's routines. They're just routines. It's turning these into routines. And then the last one is the humility to know, and this is what the great teams know, that you don't have all the answers yourself. You got to go out. You got to bring in, whether it's clients or customers, or whether it's people in different industries that think differently than you. You got to bring people in, bring them in on Zoom like this and ask them questions and whatever. Great teams bring in outsiders, they build relationships with people with resources, and they recognize that they're not an island, and that they need to continually learn, and this is how they innovate, right? So that's the package. Those are the 3 things I want leaders to know to do, and it's not rocket science. It's not rocket science, but it does take a leap of faith to start doing it.
Yeah. Well, this was great, Vanessa. Such great insight, great book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's been my pleasure to talk with you and your audience.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time on Starter TV.